take the way Marshall McLuhan talks about the differences between, for example, print and our electronic media, but very particularly the radio, that print media, for example, my blog, even though you read it on a screen and it's light, that digital light and things like that. So McLuhan would say there's other things going on there than just with the paper page with ink on it. Print visual training creates one kind of engagement and intimacy and feeling of individuality. One of the things that McLuhan talks about is the way the print revolution created the sense of privacy that we have tended to value in the modern world, that you, with a book, are by yourself, it's quiet, you are scanning the lines of the text, and it's training your attention and your mind in particular ways. The radio, in particular, destroys all of that because the radio comes to you from everywhere. If you're in projected sound, which a radio does, you are in an environment that's suddenly everywhere. Like a visual environment, you have to be looking at a particular stimulus, a picture or the text or something like that. But radio is completely immersive in a totally different sensory experience. And what McLuhan understood, I think accurately, is that that kind of experience drops you into a whole different sense of community, belonging, and both intimacy, because particularly it's like we listen to things in our headphones now. If you right now are listening to me speaking through my blue mic into the internet on headphones, you're all by yourself, right? You're very, very private, you're very closed in. If you let the speakers on your devices play my voice out, then other people in the room would also experience it. But there's both an intimacy, a direction, sort of like I speak directly to you, your ears, and this is where it gets very frightening and sort of powerful in the terrifying way that we all need to understand sorrow unable to affect us. It absorbs you into the group of the vernacular. That's a fancy way of saying what McLuhan actually described the effects of the radio. He said it was tribal. And in understanding media, he has a description of what he thinks of radio as a media, the sort of forms that it takes and the effects that it has, and he calls it explicitly the tribal drum. The radio has this collective effect. The people participating in listening to the radio feel themselves caught up both in the sort of each other's experience in this way, and also he says it intensifies a great deal more the vernacular. That whole monologuing that I was doing to sort of get you into this sinuosity of the way Radio Dragon captures you in, and you have to be listening and listening and listening and focusing and blending you in, and that is the way McLuhan reads, and that's, I think, why for those who are not as familiar as I am with things like the medieval four senses of scripture and the effects of rhetoric, don't get as much out of reading McLuhan as I do, because it's sort of patterning of experience that, if you're mainly trained in a literate context, is very hard to grasp. But if you're not aware of the way our new media has been changing us, it either seems horrifying or obvious, and it's interesting which one it is. It's like whether you think, oh yeah, of course what she's saying makes absolute sense because we're used to being on the internet, or as I'm finding when I talk to colleagues in academia and I think I've explained myself and they say, no, you've said this thing that I never actually said. We're in these clashing traditions of training our attention into the media. Male synesthesia. So I wonder which McLuhan with his media understanding was always that media intensify certain parts of our sensory and motor abilities and obsolesce or weaken others. So with reading, you lose your auditory because it's silent and you're visually focused. With these auditory electronic media, particularly with the radio, he has some pretty powerful stuff I have in the passages that you basically lose your ability to make that kind of rational judgment anymore, which is why it worked so powerfully in the 40s. So my first reading is from Marshall McLuhan and Quentin Fiore's second book. Their first one was The Medium is the Message, and it's interesting because it's like text with memes. They're already trying to do this meme thing, and I'm flipping through this one, which is War and Peace in the Global Village, and of course I find a picture of radios right there, and I said, aha, this is where I need to be. And here he is, of course, talking about the wars and the technologies that drove them, and he starts with saying that the Civil War, the American Civil War, was a railroad war, that the American Civil War was the first railway war. The mobilization of men and materials took on a brand new character, which was carefully studied by general staffs of the European countries. Railways were an incidental accompaniment of industrialization and the quest for raw materials and and market alike. All the industrial features were then extended to war, and just as every citizen had been a worker, every citizen became a soldier. Previous wars had had no such scope. The First World War was also a railway war, enormously exaggerated in scope and destruction by the extension of industrialism and the enlargement of cities. It was a war of massed armies, massed guns. At the Battle of the Somme, the Germans brought 6,000 cannon into place simultaneously. I mean, Tolkien was at the Battle of the Somme as a signal officer, right? So he was actually thinking about transmission media as his friends were dying in the trenches, right? So the Battle of the Somme, in McLuhan's understanding, it's like the railways give a particular character to both the Civil War and the First World War. The Second World War was a radio war as much as it was an industrial war. We're starting to recognize people have been noticing these things for a while, and I say, well, as medievalist, I maybe haven't thought about them, but the degree to which the media shape the kinds of conflicts we've been in. Obviously, we've been talking in our internet context about how we're in an information war now, or an economic war and such. Well, the Second World War was a radio war. The radio phase of electronics had awakened the tribal energies and visions of the European peoples in a way that television is now doing to America. He was writing in the 60s, so he's saying that, the sort of frenzy of the awakening that we see happening in World War II is thanks to the radio. And he does have a theory about why the radio doesn't affect the United States in the same way it affects Europe, because he says, unlike Europe, America has no tribal past, or at least the non-native America, I suppose. Radio thus did not appeal to any distant images of tribal unity and strength. It awakened the energies of the Negro and enabled him to dominate the culture of the 1920s in the United States through his tribal songs and dances. I mean, I'm interested that, of course, Ye, as a black musician, is tapping into some of these things that the rest of the media conversation doesn't seem to have noticed. Like, he makes music, for goodness sake, in the American tradition of rap and gospel. It goes back to, therefore, the jazz of the 20s. And so whatever we are as a country acoustically has played out in these registers. And elsewhere, McLuhan talks about how America wasn't affected by the radio in the same way Europe was, in the sense of finding these tribal folk pasts that the Germans tapped into with their radio listening. And I think he means also with the Italians and the English. It's like everybody in Europe is affected because they have a tribal memory of themselves, whereas the United States doesn't, except for in the South. And so both in our literature and in our music get that radio effect. Otherwise, apparently not, but we can argue that. Okay. When the war babies and the jazz babies reached the job plateau in the late 1920s, they rejected the goals and objectives of their elders sufficiently to create an economic slump. So the depression caused by jazz, but also radio jazz, their tribalism, I suppose. Of course, it was as nothing compared to the present slump that is just beginning with the aid of television. The radio slump or depression of 1929 to 1939 was the result of switching the vision of a whole population from visually conceived objectives to the total field of polarized energies that automatically goes with radio and auditory space. He talks a little bit about the United States as visually organized and being labeled and everything, the effect that radio had on us. First claim that the Second World War was a radio war. What does it mean to say it's a radio war? Well, again, McLuhan's frustrating because he's like flashes of insight and you have to put them all together and you hope that it all comes together. I had notes. Okay, so the Second World War is a radio war. Radio is tribal, it's auditory, not visual, and it will affect different cultures that it's introduced into depending on their previous situation as well. So, what does radio do? Well, it's tribal. We say it's tribal drums. And he says this: England and America had their shots against radio in the form of long exposure to literacy and industrialism. Okay, so he says England's different. These forms involve an intense visual organization of experience. The more earthy, I love this. He's Canadian, right? He did study in England, and he's got this very, sort of primitive, earthy and tribal vision of the rest of Europe. The more earthy and less visual European cultures were not immune to radio. Its tribal magic was not lost on them, and the old web of kinship began to resonate once more with the note of fascism. Even though I'm a medievalist, I actually know a little bit about modern history, and in my History of European Civilization section, we read, for example, the Mussolini's chapter in his encyclopedia on fascism. And with the Italians, they're very much fixed on, it's fasces, it's the Roman, sort of tradition that they want to tie themselves back into their own Italian history. And, you know, that Italian fascism was this goal of becoming Rome again, obviously. Kiltz and I alluded or talked directly, but not extensively, about the way the Italians tried to take over Ethiopia and failed. That, you know, they do have this imperial goal as the other totalitarian states did, but the Italian fascism is very focused on their sense of being Roman in the long tradition. So that old web of kinship. Starting now to think about all of the ways in which Italy wasn't Italy until it was invented in the 19th century too. So it's a fictional place, got lots of different regions. Anyway, okay. The inability of literate people to grasp the language and message of the media as such is involuntarily conveyed by the comments of sociologist Paul Lazarsfeld in discussing the effects of radio. And here we have something about monopolies. Yes, okay. So this actually, we're feeding into why the Second World War again, right? This is Paul Lazarsfeld. The last group of effects may be called the monopolistic effects of radio. Such as attracted most public attention because of their importance in the totalitarian countries. If a government monopolizes the radio, then by mere repetition and by exclusion of conflicting points of view, it can determine the opinions of the population. You see, all of these worries that we have about, you know, controlling the platforms and the government being in control of the media. The Understanding Media was published when? 1964, right? Guys, wake up. We're still in the same story. So if a government monopolizes the radio, then by mere repetition and by exclusion of conflicting points of view, it can determine the opinions of the population. We do not know much about how this monopolistic effect really worked, but it is important to note its singularity. No inference should be drawn regarding the effects of radio as such. It's not the media, as it were, although McLuhan, of course, says no, it is actually the media, but we're sort of trying to understand why you can control a population with this particular extension of our nervous systems called radio. It is often forgotten that Hitler did not achieve control through radio, but almost despite it, because at the time of his rise to power, radio was controlled by his enemies. The monopolistic effects have probably less social importance than is generally assumed, end quote. Okay, and then McLuhan makes a comment because he's like said, okay, so Lazarsfeld, he gets it that, you know, radio is important and has this power and we need to understand it and such. And then McLuhan comments, Professor Lazarsfeld's helpless unawareness of the nature and effects of radio is not a personal defect, but a universally shared ineptitude. McLuhan, I can figure this all out. You guys didn't notice what was going on. That being the central problem of the media, that insofar as we're in them, insofar as we're surrounded by them, it's very, very hard to become aware of the effects that they're having on us. And what McLuhan always says is it's not just content of what they're, you know, we're saying into them. It's the fact of their existing at all, right? And Kiltz and I sometimes gesture to that in our conversation, saying we've just said this into the internet. It's not so much that we have said these words into it, but that everything is, we're feeding ourselves, our attention, your attention into this media environment, and that itself is the thing the ark has to sail in. Here's to prove how Professor Lazarsfeld is ineptitude is universally shared. In a radio speech in Munich, March 14th, 1936, Hitler said, "I go my way with the assurance of a somnambulist. His victims and his critics have been equally somnambulistic," says McLuhan. "They danced entranced to the tribal drum of radio that extended their central nervous system to create depth involvement for everybody. I live right inside radio when I listen. I more easily lose myself in radio than in a book," said a voice from a radio pole. The power of radio to involve people in depth is manifested in its use during homework by youngsters and by many other people who carry transistor sets in order to provide a private world for themselves amidst crowds. There is a little poem by the German dramatist Bertolt Brecht. "You little box, held to me when escaping, so that your valves should not break, carried from house to ship, from ship to train, so that my enemies might go on talking to me, near my bed, to my pain, the last thing at night, the first thing in the morning, of their victories and of my cares. Promise me not to go silent all of a sudden." So this Hitler speaking into the radio, McLuhan does this like Kiltz and I do with our ark, right, in our mosaic hunting. Woo, there's a clue. Woo, there's a clue. Hitler talks about himself as sleepwalking in his performances on the radio. Hitler worked as a radio person. McLuhan goes on to say, had TV occurred on a large scale during Hitler's reign, he would have vanished quickly. Had TV come first, there would have been no Hitler at all. That Hitler only worked as a radio phenomenon. If he had been seen simply on television, nothing, right? And the example there is also McLuhan's talking about McCarthy and how as soon as things switched to television, McCarthy fizzled out. And then conversely, people like John F. Kennedy or Ronald Reagan, all of our modern politicians have to work on television or in our internet and something like that. The radio power is different. And then of course I started thinking about how conservative talk radio was so important. And you say, okay, Rush Limbaugh had the power that he did because of radio. Be thinking about the different kind of media that we're caught up in, not necessarily the content of what's being said, but the effect of being in it